we went over the basics of cellular respiration in 7th grade. So what do you remember from 7th grade about respiration? I would guess if you thought about it for a couple minutes, you could probably come up with the whole equation. How does respiration compare to photosynthesis? Brady?
It's like the opposite.
Almost the exact opposite. The products of one are the reactants of the other, and vice versa. So, who could give me what you learned in 7th grade for an equation for respiration? Anybody? So what do you need for respiration to take place? No? Dean?
ATP, carbon dioxide.
Nope. It's photosynthesis. What sugar? Glucose? What else do you need? Nope. Oxygen. And it produces 3 things. Huh? ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. So the opposite of photosynthesis needed carbon dioxide, it needed water. It produced glucose, it produced oxygen. So respiration, the general formula is pretty much the opposite. So we're going to go into far greater detail about cellular respiration than you did in 7th grade. So really, cellular respiration takes energy from glucose and basically extracts that energy, turns it into a form that the cell can actually do something with. When we talked about biochemistry, we said that between the bonds of the atoms of molecules, that's where energy is stored. Breaking those bonds can harness that energy. So glucose, 6-carbon sugar, has energy stored in the bonds that hold those atoms together. And when those bonds are broken, the energy can be harnessed. This happens through a whole bunch of steps, sort of where small amounts of energy are extracted a little bit at a time, producing ATP. There are 2 main types of respiration that we will talk about: aerobic and anaerobic respiration. The one we learned about in 7th grade, that was aerobic respiration. There's also another type called anaerobic. Aerobic respiration is respiration that requires oxygen. Anaerobic respiration does not use oxygen. So we'll start by talking about anaerobic respiration. There's another word for anaerobic respiration. It's often called fermentation. And anaerobic respiration, it takes place sometimes in conditions which there's no oxygen, or in organisms that don't have the required enzymes for aerobic respiration. Some organisms only utilize anaerobic respiration. Other organisms can utilize both, depending on whether or not oxygen is available. Anaerobic respiration happens in the cytoplasm. So when we talked about cellular respiration, which organelle did we focus on? The mitochondria. This anaerobic respiration, the first steps start in the cytoplasm. So in the cytoplasm of a cell, this process called glycolysis can happen. What does lysis mean? We learned that we use it in hydrolysis, or plasmolysis means to split. In glycolysis, a glucose molecule is split into two smaller molecules. To do that, it actually requires ATP. It needs two ATP molecules to split a glucose molecule into a molecule called pyruvate or pyruvic acid. But in the process, that releases 4 molecules of ATP. So the net gain overall is +2. So this glycolysis releases +2 ATP. So what happens to this pyruvate depends on the organism. Some organisms then turn that pyruvate into ethanol and carbon dioxide. Okay. Many yeasts do this. Many bacteria do this. It's why we use yeast to make alcoholic beverages and bread. What happens is when the yeast are mixed with a mixture that has sugar in it, whether it's malted barley or grape juice, the yeast break down the sugars in those substances through fermentation, and the byproducts are alcohol, which makes the drink alcoholic, and carbon dioxide, which can carbonate the drink as well. In bread, we mix yeast with dough, with flour and water, and then they start to break down sugars in that dough, and in the process they release carbon dioxide. What's that cause to happen to that ball of dough? It rises because the carbon dioxide bubbles are being trapped by that sort of doughy substance, and it gets bigger. The dough rises. When you slice a loaf of bread, the little sort of bubbles in there, air spaces, are where carbon dioxide was trapped from the fermentation of those yeasts. Other organisms take the pyruvate and reduce it using NADH, and that forms lactic acid. This is what happens in our muscles as we are exercising, using our muscles with intensity. That requires a lot of ATP. So our muscles use oxygen to keep them working, but if they exhaust their supply of oxygen, they cannot go through the process of aerobic respiration anymore, and then they switch to anaerobic respiration. So they're still getting some ATP, not as much, but the byproduct is lactic acid, which builds up in our muscles, makes them fatigued, makes them burn, and you just can't maintain that. Once exercise stops, our body clears out that lactic acid, oxygen is resupplied to the cells, and then we can continue. Also, some fungi, some bacteria go through lactic acid fermentation. This is used in producing certain types of cheese, in making yogurt. The bacteria found in yogurt take that pyruvate, turn it into lactic acid, and that turns the milk into the yogurt. So you see sort of the 2 alternative paths. We have the pyruvic acid, which can be either turned into lactic acid, or can be turned into ethanol and carbon dioxide as a release. There's sort of 2 pathways depending on the organism. So the products that you might be familiar with that are a product of fermentation, we use fermentation a lot, different types of food. Swiss cheese comes from fermentation. The holes in the cheese are caused by carbon dioxide bubbles building up by this bacteria. Cheddar cheese, different type of bacteria is used. Lactic acid fermentation happens to produce yogurt, lots of cheeses. Soy sauce is also a product of lactic acid fermentation. When you add acid to milk, I mean, you could make cheese just by adding lemon juice to a gallon of milk. And the acidity of that lemon juice causes the milk proteins to sort of coagulate, and you get this very simple cheese from it. So that's sometimes how cheese is made. Ethanol and carbon dioxide are produced in certain yeast, produce alcoholic beverages. Nail polish remover, acetone, is produced through fermentation. Vinegars are produced through different bacteria that turns the pyruvic acid into acetic acid. So there's all sorts of products. Sauerkraut, kimchi are all fermented products that people commonly use. All right, we're going to spend most of our time talking about the details of aerobic respiration. Respiration that uses oxygen. So aerobic respiration can produce much more ATP than anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration can produce 36 ATP molecules for each molecule of glucose. And the process starts off just like anaerobic respiration. It starts off with glycolysis. Take a glucose molecule, split it into 2 pyruvates, and that gives 2 ATP molecules. The difference is that in aerobic respiration, those pyruvate molecules go through a cycle called the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle. Okay, that happens in the mitochondria. And that ends in the electron transport chain, which makes ATP in the same way that ATP was produced in photosynthesis. This is our sort of generic equation for photosynthesis. Gives us the reactants and the products. The steps along the way, are pretty complex, but understanding the basics of them is not too complicated. And we'll look at those steps in some more detail. So, at the very base, we have glucose, goes through the process of glycolysis. The products are sent into the Krebs cycle. The products of that are sent to the electron transport chain to make ATP. So that's simplified. A little more complex. But again, a lot of these things will look familiar. Starting with glucose, which produces 2 pyruvates, giving us some ATP. Also produces NADH. What is NADH? What can we call it? What's that? It is neutral because it's carried compared to NAD plus because it's carrying what? Yes, it is an electron carrier. Just like NADPH was an electron carrier. So it takes some electrons, it's going to bring them somewhere else. So that's glycolysis. That pyruvate is changed into acetyl-CoA, releases some carbon dioxide, and produces some more NADH. The acetyl-CoA goes into the Krebs cycle. Okay, Krebs cycle produces some carbon dioxide, produces some ATP, and some more NADH. And some other electron carrier, FADH2. All of these electron carriers are sending their electrons over here to the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain uses the energy from these electrons to make a large quantity of ATP. The process we call chemiosmosis. So in a little more visual format, glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. Okay? The other parts happen in the mitochondria, producing a total of 36 ATP molecules. The Kreb cycle takes in those pyruvates and then changes them over a series of steps, sort of extracting some energy in the form of these electrons. So for every glucose, the Kreb cycle has to go twice, one for each pyruvate. And it uses that pyruvate to produce ATP, FADH2, NADH, and carbon dioxide as a waste product. So glucose, how many carbons? 6 carbons in a glucose molecule. After glycolysis, how many carbons are in the pyruvates? So glucose has 6 carbons. How many in the 2 pyruvates each? 3 each. That's this C3 here. 3 carbon molecule is pyruvate. If it releases a carbon dioxide, how many carbons are left? 2. That combines with a 4 carbon molecule that's coming in through the cycle, forming 6 carbons. Releases a carbon dioxide, making it 5 carbons, releasing some ATP in the process. Loses another carbon dioxide, turns into a 4 carbon molecule. In the process, producing some NADH. Okay? That 4 carbon molecule can then be ready to recombine here and start this cycle over again. And so we have this repeating cycle with these pyruvic acid molecules being slowly broken down, producing the products. Here's a little more detail for you. So you certainly don't need to know all of these details, but if you're curious about it, if you want to see sort of a more visual representation, we have our 3 carbon pyruvate up here. Okay. We lose a carbon dioxide. Okay. Gets combined, okay, with a 4 carbon, so that turns it into this acetyl-CoA. That gets combined with this 4 carbon molecule, and that gives us a 6 carbon, okay, which gets transformed into the 5 carbon, transformed into 4 carbons, and so forth. So we have this cycle. Along the way, we're producing our NADH. We're releasing some carbon dioxide, okay, and that process repeats. So all of those electrons that have been harvested by NADH, by FADH2, are being brought over to an electron transport chain which functions just like it did in photosynthesis. The electron transport chain uses this process to produce 32 molecules of ATP through a series of redox reactions, oxidation reduction reactions. And so it's the NADH and the FADH2, which are the electron carriers in this process. Some of them were formed in glycolysis, some were formed in the Krebs cycle. And they're shuttling these electrons over to the electron transport chain. So as we talked about our question of the day, NADH, that's the reduced form when it has gained electrons. FADH2, that is the reduced form. Their oxidized forms are NAD plus and FAD. So these electron carriers bring the electrons to the electron transport chain. These are these complexes of proteins and other molecules that are embedded in the membrane that's inside of the mitochondria. Remember, mitochondria looks like that bean with the folds inside of it. The folds are a membrane. Those folds are where the electron transport chain is located. And so NADH, FADH2 are oxidized, and what that does is it pumps protons across the membrane, building up a concentration gradient. And then as that concentration gradient builds up, it's released by coming through ATP synthase, which makes ATP. And that's where the ATP from respiration comes from. As those hydrogen ions, those protons are coming in, they combine with oxygen. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor, and that forms water. Oxygen plus the hydrogen form water, and that's why oxygen is needed for aerobic respiration. It acts as a final acceptor for electrons through the electron transport chain. There's no oxygen, that process sort of bottlenecks, cannot continue. So, to give it a little more visual sense, this is the intermembrane in the mitochondria. Here is the electron transport chain molecules. They're cytochromes. NADH, which was an electron carrier that was produced in glycolysis, was produced in the Kreb cycle, gives its electrons along with FADH2. Those electrons go down in energy level, and that energy is used to pump these protons onto the other side of this membrane. And so here, protons are building up. They eventually come back in through this membrane, but they pass through ATP synthase. Molecule that uses that energy coming through to take ADP and make it into ATP. As they do that, those hydrogen ions, those protons, combine with oxygen, and that's where the water comes from. Putting everything all together, pyruvate from the cytoplasm comes in, turns into acetyl-CoA, goes into the Kreb cycle, releases some ATP, releases some carbon dioxide, and harvests electrons. These electrons are sent to the membrane, where the electrons move through the electron transport chain, pumping protons out. Protons come back in, forming ATP. Hydrogen combines with oxygen, and we have the production of 32 ATP through the electron transport chain. Just another depiction. It walks you through all the steps: glucose, glycolysis to pyruvate, to acetyl-CoA, to Krebs cycle, electrons over here, makes oxidation. So we see in this general diagram all of the parts of our generic formula for respiration. Glucose plus oxygen produces ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. So now you know where all those things come from in that general form. Any questions?